Let's start learning the female reproductive structures. So first, before we begin, these are some non-reproductive structures. So we've got the rectum back here. So this is the GI tract. Here's the urinary bladder and the urethra. And then here's the pubic symphysis. If you remember, the pubic symphysis is the joint that holds your two hip bones together in the front. So first thing we're going to talk about is the female external genitalia, which are collectively called the vulva. So that includes what's known as the mons pubis, which is this extra bit of adipose tissue in front of the pubic symphysis. The clitoris, which is analogous to the male penis. So this gives the woman a arousal during sexual intercourse. And then there's two labia, labia majora and labia minora. So those are considered the external genitalia. The internal genitalia include the vagina. So here's the vaginal opening, and this is the vaginal canal or vagina. And the vagina serves as a receptacle for semen, as well as serving as the last portion of the birth canal during normal childbirth. One thing to remember is that the vagina protects itself from microbial growth by being acidic. And that acidity is going to get neutralized by the semen. Semen has some alkalinity to it, and that will help to neutralize that acidity. The acidity would be dangerous for the sperm cells. So then we see the uterus. The opening to the uterus is in the cervix. So cervix means neck. So this is kind of the neck area of the uterus. This rounded portion here is the fundus of the uterus. And we'll take a closer look at the layers of the uterus and a little more anatomy in an upcoming picture. But you'll notice the position of the uterus is what's known as anteflexion. So it's kind of got this anterior curvature to it, and it lies on top or superior to the urinary bladder. There's an ovary. Ovary, again, is the female gonad. Inside that ovary, we're going to find ovarian follicles, which are these little containers for the developing oocyte or egg. And the ovary produces hormones, estrogen, progesterone, relaxin, and inhibin. The uterine tube or fallopian tube is positioned in order to receive the ovulated oocyte. So it has these little finger-like structures called fimbriae. Here's the actual tube portion. So ovulation occurs when the egg is released into the fallopian tube and starts to travel. If sperm is in there, right, sperm entered from the vagina, then into the uterus, and then into that fallopian tube, fertilization will occur in the fallopian tube. So that's the site where we need fertilization to occur. And then if fertilization does occur, it's going to transport that embryo towards the uterus for implantation. Here's another picture to work on female reproductive structures. Here's the vaginal canal or vagina. Again, here's the cervix of the uterus and the opening to the cervix. This area here would just be the uterine cavity. This upper rounded part being the fundus. And then basically, if you're not the fundus or the cervix, we call you the body of the uterus. We see a couple ovaries here positioned on each side and fallopian tubes on each side. You'll notice that the uterus has three important layers to it. The outer layer being the perimetrium. The muscle layer, smooth muscle layer, is the myometrium, which is going to respond to a couple hormones. And then the inner lining is known as the endometrium. And that endometrium is going to be changing quite a bit during the female reproductive cycle. There's a lot of ligaments that position the female structures properly. We see a round ligament here. We see an ovarian ligament, which actually attaches the ovary to the uterus. This is all known as the broad ligament, this large flat ligament here. And then there's a suspensory ligament. So ligaments help positioning. You'll notice that the ovary has to be positioned with the fallopian tube in order to capture that ovulated oocyte. And this area of the fallopian tube that kind of funnels in the oocyte is called the infundibulum, which means funnel. The ampulla is this wider part of the fallopian tube. And then the little fingers are called fimbriae or a fimbria. All right, so now we move on to breasts. A little bit about female breasts. Respond to hormones, a number of hormones. Estrogen from the ovary during puberty is going to stimulate glandular tissue development. And then prolactin from the anterior pituitary stimulates milk production. And oxytocin, produced by the hypothalamus and secreted by the posterior pituitary, stimulates the milk ejection or letdown. Now let's look inside of an ovary. So inside of the ovary is where you're going to find ovarian follicles. And this is a very important topic to be worked on, and make sure you understand this development of the follicles before we get into the female reproductive cycle. So when a woman is born, a baby girl is born, the ovary is loaded with what's known as primordial follicles. Those are these small little structures, and inside those little structures is where the oogenesis is going to be occurring. So each follicle could ultimately produce one egg. And then that egg or oocyte gets ovulated and enters the fallopian tube. But in order to get to that point, all right, which you'll notice right here is an ovulation event, there's these stages that it goes through, all right? And this is either called development or maturation of the follicles. So when a baby girl is born, the ovary is full of this stage, and they don't really mature until puberty, because that's when FSH is produced, or follicle stimulating hormone. So that hormone was named after the function it has on these follicles. It stimulates them to mature. And as long as FSH is being produced by the anterior pituitary, follicles will be undergoing follicular development. So the primordials will begin to mature into the next stage called primary. Now, if a girl is born with tens of thousands of these, we don't want them all to maturing at the same time. So just a few of them will start the process, right? So during that first female cycle, you might get one or two progress to a primary, and then eventually each cycle you want to get to a mature follicle, all right? So they have to mature from a primary to a secondary, and then one mature follicle a cycle gets produced, all right? So this is called the mature or Graafian follicle. And that's going to be the one that's going to ovulate its oocyte, and that oocyte will then enter the fallopian tube. Now, what's very important to understand is it's not just a single cell that gets ovulated. It's the secondary oocyte, and we'll talk more about what that means, but it's surrounded by a lot of other cells called the corona radiata. All right, now notice the size difference. This oocyte is a very large cell. All right, the corona radiata is made up of normal size cells that surround that oocyte. So that oocyte and the corona radiata is what enters the fallopian tube and starts to travel down this fallopian tube until it either gets fertilized or it doesn't get fertilized. Now, very important is to know what happens to this empty follicle. It actually kind of collapses inward, and forms a structure called the corpus luteum. Corpus means mass, luteum means yellow. It's a little yellow mass that forms from that empty follicle. Now, what's very important is it's an endocrine structure. So the corpus luteum is going to produce large amounts of estrogen, progesterone, relaxin, and inhibin after ovulation occurs. All right. Then, if pregnancy does occur, it has to keep making these hormones because they're going to help progress the pregnancy. If pregnancy doesn't occur, the corpus luteum degenerates, meaning it kind of shrivels up and doesn't produce hormones anymore. And it's the change from the corpus luteum to the corpus albicans is basically what starts the cycle over again. So corpus albicans means white. So the yellow mass kind of collapses and becomes this tiny little white mass that no longer produces hormones. So when we refer to follicular development, we're referring to this progress that these follicles take from primordial, primary, secondary, then the mature follicle, again, one of those per cycle, then it ovulates, and then it forms the corpus luteum and then corpus albicans. All right, this is our figure just discussing oogenesis, which is, again, it's meiosis, so it's going to have a lot of similarities to spermatogenesis in that you're going to start with a cell and you end up with 4. Now, the big difference is only one of the 4 is functional. All right. Now, notice that the first round of meiosis takes the primary oocyte and divides it into a secondary oocyte and a polar body. The polar bodies are the non-functional gametes. All right. So we don't produce 4 functional gametes. We produce 1 and then 3 non-functional. All right. And those 3 non-functional, though, each have a set of chromosomes. So it's a way to get rid of 3 sets of chromosomes because you don't want all those sets of chromosomes in the egg. You want just 1 set. All right. You want 23 chromosomes. Now, what else is interesting is meiosis doesn't complete unless fertilization occurs. So notice it's this stage here, the secondary oocyte stage, that gets ovulated. So meiosis hasn't finished. All right, it still has to progress inside the fallopian tube, but it only finishes if a sperm is present. All right, so notice now we have this sperm fertilizing, and then you get this second division and formation of this last polar body. So oogenesis results in 3 polar bodies, one here, and one here, and then the fertilized ovum. And once fertilization occurs, you're back to 2 sets of 23 chromosomes, and you're called the diploid zygote. Diploid means you have 2 sets of chromosomes. All right, so this is the process of oogenesis. Again, right up till about here, it occurs inside the ovary, and then the rest of this occurs inside the fallopian tube. This is just lining up these two. So here is oogenesis, what we just talked about. This is a little more clear to me because notice it gives you the result right here. 3 polar bodies and then the ovum being fertilized. Now, if there isn't a sperm, meiosis doesn't have to finish. There's no point. And then notice where this is occurring. These early stages occur in the primordial follicle. Then during childhood, nothing really happens. The primordial follicles stay primordial, and meiosis kind of gets stuck in what's known as prophase 1. All right, there's no hormones. So none of this is going to progress until puberty. And when puberty hits, we start this process. So the primary follicle forms, secondary follicle forms, Mature follicle forms. Notice what's inside the mature follicle. Secondary oocyte and a polar body. And then that is what gets ovulated. And only if a sperm is present does it finish meiosis II. Then you have that fertilized ovum, which then becomes what's known as the diploid zygote. Again, this is all happening in the fallopian tube. Then we get a whole bunch of mitosis, which forms the embryo. And the embryo is going to implant inside the uterus and then continue to develop there until it becomes the fetus. And the fetal period begins at week 9. All right, so week 9 to birth is what we call the fetal period. All right, let's look at the hormones. Let's start a new video for the hormones. So I think we need to start a nice new video because this last stuff is going to be the really important stuff and might take a little more brain power. But the next video we're going to introduce the hormones. Then we're going to learn what they do as we progress through a female reproductive cycle.